Okay, so get ready because today we're diving into something pretty wild, like seriously sci-fi stuff.
It's definitely next level thinking.
Yeah, we're talking about the Machu Picchu project
Right.
and using things like blockchain and AI to like totally reinvent the safety net for vulnerable communities.
Yeah.
When I first saw this, I was like, is this for real?
Yeah, it's really interesting how it kind of tackles head on the flaws in the ways we try to help people, like the systems that are supposed to be there but often, miss the mark.
Right, like those systems were built for a different world almost.
Exactly. Like take insurance and banking, for example. These can be really difficult systems to navigate for anyone, but for certain communities, they're either too expensive, too bureaucratic, or just don't make sense culturally.
Totally. So where did they even begin with this project? Like, how do you even start to change something so fundamental?
Well, they're looking at risk itself. So instead of individuals or communities transferring risk to a big company like a traditional insurance model, they're suggesting a shift back to risk sharing.
Interesting. So bringing back that age-old idea of communities supporting each other, but like with a digital upgrade.
Yeah, exactly. And the document actually gives this really compelling example with Vietnamese farmers using a system kind of like this.
Okay.
Imagine a group of farmers all facing those same kind of like unpredictable challenges that could wipe out their income, bad weather, pests, things like that.
Yeah, that's a tough situation to be in. How would this risk-sharing idea actually help them?
So instead of relying on outside insurance, which might be difficult for them to get, they would pool a small amount of their savings together.
Okay.
So it's like this safety net they create and control themselves, funded by the community, for the community.
I can see how that would be empowering, but those kinds of informal agreements, I don't know, they haven't always worked out so well in the past. Haven't they sometimes been a bit, well, unfair or lacked transparency?
Absolutely. And that's where the technology comes in. They're talking about using blockchain technology, specifically smart contracts, to make the whole thing secure and transparent.
Hold on, blockchain. That's the tech behind Bitcoin, right?
Yeah.
Help me understand how that fits in here.
Right. So think of a smart contract like a digital agreement. But the key difference is it automatically enforces the rules that have been agreed upon.
So no more guesswork, no more potential for disputes because everything is pre-programmed and tamper-proof.
Exactly. Let's say a farmer's crop is wiped out by a flood and she needs to access those funds. She submits a request to the network.
Okay.
The smart contract, because it's coded with the community's rules, verifies her eligibility automatically. If everything checks out, the funds are released instantly, directly from the pool. No middleman, no bureaucracy, just immediate support.
Yeah, okay, now I'm starting to see how this could be huge for a community like that. But it's more than just the money, right? This idea of using technology to actually empower people. That's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads us to another big part of the Machu Picchu project, the idea that individuals can actually own and control their own data.
Okay, now that's something I want to hear more about. You're saying these farmers could use this tech to not just protect their data, but benefit from it.
Exactly. And that's where things get really, really interesting. We're talking about a complete shift in the power dynamics here. I mean, we hear all the time about how valuable data is these days, right? For aid, for development, for business. But what if the people who are actually generating that valuable data, what if they had control over it?
Okay.
What if they could decide who could access it, how it was used, and even get paid for it? That's the kind of fundamental change this project is going for.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's their information. They should be the ones who benefit. But how do you actually make that happen? Especially when we're talking about people who maybe aren't, tech experts themselves.
Right, exactly. It's not just about having the data. It's about making it usable and accessible, even for someone who's not, a computer whiz. That's where they bring in this really interesting mix of blockchain with something called IPFS. You heard of that?
At PFS?
Maybe.
I think I've heard the term, but
Yeah.
it definitely need a refresher.
Yeah, so basically, think of IPFS like this massive, secure, and like really important decentralized hard drive.
Okay.
So instead of your information being stored on a server, owned by some big company, it's spread out across this network of computers.
So you're kind of taking that information and scattering it so no one entity can control or manipulate it.
Okay.
That makes sense from a security perspective, but how does a farmer, let's say, actually use this system?
So imagine this. A farmer, let's call her Miss Sow, the one from the document she works with, a local, field officer from an NGO who's part of the program. And together they create this kind of digital profile for her on IPFS, one that she controls.
Okay.
And this profile has all this information about her and her farm, the crops she grows, how big her land is, her family's health records, stuff like that.
It's like a digital fingerprint, but instead of just identifying her, it tells her story.
Exactly. And here's where things get really interesting. She gets to decide who can see her profile and what they can see it for.
Okay.
So let's say a humanitarian organization, they need data on farming practices in her region. They can request access, but Miss Sao, she gets to say yes or no.
Wow.
She can even choose what parts of her information they can see.
That's real ownership, isn't it? It's not just about privacy, though that's obviously important, but it's about giving her control in a world where data is constantly being, bought and sold, often without people even knowing about it.
Exactly. And it goes even further. The Machu Picchu project says she should be able to make money from her data.
Really?
Imagine NGOs or governments or even businesses paying a small fee to access the data she chooses to share.
So it's like her data becomes an asset, something she can actually earn from. Wow, that's really empowering. But how would those transactions even work? We're talking potentially tiny amounts of money here. Wouldn't bank fees just eat it all up?
That's another clever part of this project. They've thought about that, and they suggest using something that's a big topic in finance right now. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs.
Okay, I've heard of CBDCs, but I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure I understand them. Can you explain how they fit into all of this?
Sure. So CBDCs are basically digital versions of a country's currency issued by the central bank, like a digital dollar or a digital euro.
So instead of using like Bitcoin, it's using a digital currency that's directly tied to a country's existing financial system.
Exactly. And that's why it works well for something like the Machu Picchu project. They propose integrating these CBDCs into the system so someone like Miss Sao can get paid for her data quickly, securely, and without those high fees.
Okay, so it bypasses all those banking roadblocks. That's really smart. And because it's all still happening on the blockchain, you have a record of every transaction. So there's that transparency and accountability built in, right?
Absolutely. And this CBDC piece, it's not just for data monetization either. Remember those cash and voucher assistance programs, the ones that often get bogged down in delays?
Yeah. It seems like those programs have the best intentions, but the actual implementation can be really tricky.
Exactly. Now imagine using CBDCs to make that whole process much smoother.
Yeah, it's great that those programs exist, but it seems like there's a lot of wasted time and potential there.
Exactly. And that's what's so interesting about this idea. Instead of waiting for a check or dealing with vouchers, the aid could be sent instantly, like right to Ms. Sao's phone using CBDCs.
Yeah, that does sound way more efficient, but then how do you make sure the aid is actually used for what it's supposed to be used for? Yeah. It's a question that comes up a lot, right? Even with the traditional programs.
It's a good point. And the Machu Picchu project actually addresses this directly. They want to use those smart contracts we were talking about.
Oh, right. Those digital agreements enforced by the blockchain.
Yeah, exactly. So let's say the aid is specifically for buying new seeds or fertilizer. They could actually code the smart contract so that the CBDCs Miss Sao receives, she can only use them at specific vendors, the ones selling those supplies.
Like a safety net with like a built-in guide, to make sure that help actually reaches its destination.
That's a great way to put it. And what I think is really well thought out is that it still gives her choices. So within the program, Miss Sa still gets to decide what seeds or fertilizer are best for her. It's about finding that balance, right? Making sure the aid is used effectively, but also respecting her decisions.
Totally. It's clear that they've really considered the potential problems and not just relied on good intentions, which is so important. What started as this conversation about blockchain and finance has become something much bigger. We're talking about trust and empowerment and really changing who has the power. But realistically, can this work on a larger scale? I mean, can these systems actually be accessible and affordable for everyone who needs them?
That's the million-dollar question, and the documents admit there aren't all the answers yet. But they do point out some really promising directions using technology that's already out there and affordable. Like, we don't need the latest smartphones for this to work.
Right. A lot of this could run on basic mobile phones, something that's already pretty common even in remote areas.
Exactly. And when it comes to the more complex stuff like the blockchain nodes themselves, they're looking at things like solar-powered microcomputers. It's about being resourceful, not necessarily expensive.
It's about working smarter, not just bigger, which seems fitting for a project named after Machu Picchu. This deep dive, it's more than just a potential solution. It feels like we're getting a glimpse of a totally different future for aid and development, even the whole idea of a safety net.
Absolutely. It makes you think, What if the best solutions aren't imposed from the top down, but come from the communities themselves?
It's definitely something to think about. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, and I'm sure our listeners got a lot out of it. Thanks for taking this journey with us. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a topic that's sure to get you thinking differently.